Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 8 of the course, History of Christianity. This week we will wrap up our survey of the history of Christianity. Our topic is the 20th century. Now, of course, we're covering less time this week than we have in previous weeks, but we're also talking about events that are much closer to our own experience today and about which opinions will widely differ. Another caveat, we're clearly going to pass over many things that should ideally be included in such a survey, but our limited time limits our ability to cover everything. So hopefully this will give us at least a flavor of this defining century in the history of Christianity. So let's get started. I've chosen as our title image here an image of Martin Luther King Jr., the important civil rights leader. He was himself a Baptist preacher, and there is much to say about the role of Christianity in inspiring and driving the civil rights movement. We will say a bit about that later in our presentation. Last time, remember, we'll begin with this as we always do, we covered the period from 1648 to 1900, looking at initially in that early period the reaction against the wars of religion. We talked about this under the heading of Enlightenment indifference and hostility to religious authorities. The problem was religious leaders. The problem, we would say today, was organized religion, right? The goal was to privatize religion, to make it a matter of personal conviction held in private rather than of public interest enforced in the public sphere. We looked at the event known as the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. There have been several. The role of Christianity in the abolition of slavery, as well as the American and French revolutions, followed by the Napoleonic Wars and the legacy of those, and setting up this conflict between the modern world and Christianity. We'll see how that continues to play out this week. We saw challenges from Feuerbach and Marx and Darwin, among others, but especially those three, challenges that raised questions about Christian teachings more than ever before, and certainly in new ways than ever before. We saw political challenges, the unification of the Italian peninsula and the Republic of Italy, the response to that by the Catholic Church in the First Vatican Council, and some tensions within the Catholic Church itself in the form of modernism. Finally, we looked at some examples of defining events in the United States during the 19th century, including how this notion of a wall of separation played out in relation to the First Amendment to the Constitution, the case of Charles Finney and his role in making conversion something that we could actually contribute to, the Civil War, and the rise of Pentecostalism. So here we are at the beginning of the 20th century, and as I say, we're going to pass over certain events that ideally should have been included. We can begin with World War I, known as the Great War at the time, prior to World War II. This started in 1914. 35 million people died in this conflict. This was not itself in any sense a religious war. It was a war between nation states. Certain treaty obligations led nations to come to the aid of other nations, and we will have learned about this in other classes. It did have the effect, though, of dividing Europe, of weakening European economies, and importantly for us, of ending this notion of Christendom. Remember, a kingdom is the dom of a king. Christendom was the dominion, the kind of political authority, the visible unity of Christianity in Europe. Europe was often referred to as Christendom, right? The whole stretch of Christianity across the world was Christendom. The divisions that were shown among these ostensibly Christian nations, I say divisions, I mean the brutal murder and conflict among these nations, put paid to this idea of Europe being in any sense united as a Christian region, as a Christian dominion. This also, the war triggered in various ways that we cannot go into here, of course, the Russian Revolution, and that in turn had very significant consequences to Christianity. We can say a bit more about that presently. In Russia, we see a adoption of Marx's ideas, Karl Marx's ideas, whom we spoke about last week, in a way that had never taken place in Western Europe. Marx himself had always supposed that the revolution of the proletariat, of the working class, that he wished to see and expected to see, would take place in perhaps in Germany, in Western Europe, in places that were industrialized. Russia was not at this time so industrialized as Western Europe. It was largely an agricultural society. However, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution of 1917, Marx's ideas were put into practice in a way that the world had not yet seen. In the view of Lenin, religion was a tool of oppression. It was, as McGrath says here, cynically used against the peasants by the Russian ruling class. This follows precisely Marx's view of religion. It is an ideology. Remember, ideology has a negative connotation. It's something that is dogmatic. It is something that is not open to criticism or to new evidence. And Lenin held that religion in Russia was precisely playing this role. And so, in order to effect the revolution in the way that he sought to do, it was necessary to undo what religion had taught people over many centuries. However, even though there was a massive effort of government propaganda and campaigns, for example, McGrath highlights the work of the League of Militant Atheists across the new Soviet Union. The practice of religion persisted underground in something like the way we saw earlier in the course when Christians were practicing in the catacombs. However, visibly, Christianity in Russia suffered immensely during this time. McGrath writes the following, and I'll simply quote it for us here. Churches were closed or destroyed, often by dynamiting, priests imprisoned, exiled, or executed. On the eve of the Second World War, there were only 6,376 clergy remaining in the Russian Orthodox Church, compared with the pre-revolutionary figure of 66,140. That's a very significant depletion in the number of priests. In 1917, there were 39,530 churches in Russia. By 1940, 950 remained functional. However one feels about the Russian Revolution, I'm not here to take a position on that conflict or to tell you to take a position. In terms of the history of Christianity, this was an enormously significant event. The Russian Orthodox Church had structured and given certain kind of guidance to Russian society, I guess, again, for many centuries. And so to have it so decimated, literally within a generation, was an epochal event. But we see here the energy that accompanied this on the part of Lenin. This was an inspiring time from the point of view of the Bolsheviks and the Russian revolutionaries. It was a time of undoing these illusions, right? Plucking the flowers from the chains and also breaking the chains. So we're again back to what we saw from Marx last week. This is an implementation of that view in practice. After World War I and the Russian Revolution in Europe, there was great disillusionment, especially with the idea of progress. For many decades, there had been a sense that, since the American and French revolutions especially, society was developing, culture was developing, people were becoming more rational, they were more reasonable, political institutions were becoming more stable, you had fewer tyrants and fewer, cases of the arbitrary imposition of force or authority. However, after the war and 35 million people dying in that war and what had been thought of as Christendom, there was a forecast of, as McGrath puts it here, the end of Western civilization. That phrase that you may have heard before comes from this period most directly. This was accompanied by a case relevant to our recent experience, 50 to 100 million people dying in the so-called Spanish flu, the influenza pandemic that swept across the world. This was an enormously deadly event and left people feeling disoriented and uncertain. Of course, it was accompanied intellectually by things like Einstein's theory of relativity, new developments in art and in architecture. It was a time of great disorientation, as well as great ferment and many new and exciting ideas. In Germany especially, McGrath highlights theologians felt a sense of guilt for advocating the war previously. And this led to the warm reception for the ideas of the individual pictured on the slide here, Karl Barth. Karl Barth challenged the way in which, since Schleiermacher and earlier German thinkers, Christianity and culture had been kind of woven together, like they could just be cozy with each other, they could get along. Barth says Christianity has never had that relationship to culture. Christianity is not just about beautiful things and nice values. Christianity is a call by Jesus Christ to radically transform your life. As McGrath puts it, Barth rejects any attempt to anchor God in the natural world on the one hand or human culture on the other. God is wholly other. God is above and separate from the world. The response to God's call for a Christian is not simply to be a gentleman or a lady in culture, right? To be a nice citizen, but to, where necessary, stand against that culture. And this is motivated by what is mentioned here above of theologians in Germany recognizing their error in just going along with the German war program, leading to this catastrophic event of the Great War. In 1934, as we're leading into World War II, about which we will say very little in our lecture today, Karl Barth took part or signed the Barmann Declaration, as it was known, which included in part the following: we reject the false doctrine that apart from this ministry, the church could give itself or allow itself to be given special leaders, Führers, vested with ruling authority. That apart from this ministry, apart from the leadership of the church itself, the church does not recognize a political leader as their, in this case, their Führer, right? So this is a year after Adolf Hitler is elected and rises to power in Germany. And this was a case in this very early time of theologians seeking not to follow the path that they had followed in the previous war, which had led to such a catastrophic result. We will have heard that this was not as successful as these theologians may have hoped. The Barmann Declaration was, one statement among many, and a lot of churches in Germany, including the Catholic Church, were less active in their resistance to the Nazi regime and prosecution of the war than subsequent commentators would have liked them to be. But it's worthwhile noting that this statement was made and this effort was made to separate Christianity from culture. Speaking of the separation of Christianity from culture, meanwhile, in the United States, here we have an image of William Jennings Bryan, who was involved in the event known as the Scopes trial, the so-called monkey trial of 1925. This concerns the tension between evolutionism, so-called, and creationism. In the 1910s, we see this publication of a series of books called The Fundamentals. And this laid the groundwork for a programmatic response to cultural changes following upon scientific discoveries and also the events soon after that we have just discussed. McGrath writes the following: a siege mentality became characteristic of the movement. Fundamentalist counter communities saw themselves, to evoke the pioneer spirit, as circles of wagons, defending their distinctive beliefs against an unbelieving and increasingly secular culture. There's this way of the world, secular philosophy, secular culture, right? And the goal is, in a way, similar to Barth, not simply to go along with that, but to stand against that, to defend the fundamentals, right? There are certain teachings of Christianity that are not open to compromise. Things for some Christians, like the creation of the world in 7 days. We would call that position young earth creationism, right? A lot of the conflicts that we see still very much today in the United States between Christian, especially Christian evangelicals, also Catholics and others, and the secular world result from this movement known as fundamentalism, which certainly still continues today under various names, including the name fundamentalism. We have an image here of the Anti-Evolution League, the Conflict, Hell and the High School. So it says Bryan's books here. So that's William Jennings Bryan, who represented the side in the Scopes trial, defending the teaching of creationism in public schools. And we see people gathered around to purchase these books. This was a significant movement. To the south of the United States, in Mexico, I think it is important to note some of the conflicts that happened in this century and the previous in that place. After losing territory, McGrath writes here, to the U.S. in the 1850s, Mexico establishes a new constitution, 1857, and this is a highly secular constitution. Mexico is not simply a country where the Catholic Church has power and authority up to today. Mexico has a really strong history of challenging church authority, stripping the church in 1857 of its property and of certain rights that it had formerly enjoyed. 1917, another constitution is adopted in Mexico that is even more opposed to Catholicism. Calles, the new president, is an atheist openly, and he criminalizes the wearing of religious items and the saying of adios, which would mean to God, right? 1927, this is followed by a resistance movement among Christians. This movement is known as the Cristeros. They stage an armed revolt against the government, but even Catholic bishops do not support them. So again, we see a tension between Christianity and culture, a tension between the so-called secular world, the non-religious world, and the church. The Cristeros are taking the position of the church, position of Christian faith, something like in the way Karl Barth did, something like in the way the fundamentalists in the United States did. All of them very different positions, of course, but they're opposing the secular world. Catholic bishops are a little more on the fence about it, right? They're trying to kind of split the difference, or they're trying to find some kind of middle ground, or to negotiate, or to compromise. But the history of Christianity is, of course, marked by people willing to stand up in cases of such conflicts and to witness, as it would be said in Christianity, to their faith. The case of Perpetua, the early martyr in the church, the author of the earliest text we have from a woman in the history of Christianity, is a clear example of that. We see here some images which are pretty low resolution, one of them being of a priest facing a firing squad, and another being of some of the Cristero fighters at that time, the late 1920s. Very prominently, you can see wearing these crosses in opposition to the constitutional decree in 1917. Back to Europe, and in a more intellectual vein. Sigmund Freud, the very important psychologist and one of the founders of the field of psychology as it's practiced today, proved to be very influential in the United States, but of course also in Europe and throughout what is called the West. McGrath writes, Freud argued that religion could be accounted for psychoanalytically. Religion is a human creation, the result of an obsession with ritual and veneration of a father figure. Religion is, we have here on the next point, an obsessional neurosis, right? We are obsessed to follow rules, to get things right, to please our Father, right? We work, when we fail in this, to expiate that guilt through rituals, through confession. The whole kind of apparatus of Christian religion is challenged by Freud. Freud's work makes counseling and therapy a common practice in the United States. And significantly, we see a shift from the priest being the figure that people would tend to go to discuss their, call them spiritual problems, personal problems, marital problems, right? Now the therapist or the counselor begins to take that role. So this is a way in which the place of Christianity in society shifted very significantly as alternative ways of addressing that need to work through one's personal issues and challenges were provided. As I said before, we passed over the Second World War, pausing only in 1934 to mention the Barmann Declaration. But after that war, 1945, of course, Lenin's successor, Stalin, extends the sphere of Soviet influence over Eastern Europe. Um, the state ideology continues, as it was under Lenin, to be atheism. And in 1953, the Communist Party decrees that teaching in schools should be indeed saturated with atheism. There should be a society-wide effort to expunge this false ideology, this teaching of religion that keeps people down. We need to liberate society from those things, right? We need to start with the young, a very common and effective strategy of propaganda. In 1949, the USSR backs the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong and to take control of mainland China. And in subsequent decades, the movement known as the Cultural Revolution in China aims to accomplish there much the same outcome as was sought in Russia, that is to, so to speak, saturate the country with atheism. In this way, the Cold War appeared to many at the time as a conflict between religion and atheism, with Russia and China and other communist countries, of course, being on the atheist side, and the United States leading a coalition of those who were godly in some sense. And a lot of things that one could say about that. It's notable that the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance were added in the 1950s in direct response to these developments in the Soviet Union and in China. In the United States, we saw earlier that fundamentalism had arisen as a movement of opposition between Christianity and the culture. Right? We're going to fight the culture. We're going to oppose the culture, or in fact, perhaps better, we're simply going to remove ourselves from the culture. We are going to found new communities. We are going to found new publishing outlets and new media outlets, and we're going to create a culture that's a truly Christian culture, right, separate from the secular world. Many, however, began to feel that this was a counterproductive strategy, that this tension between Christianity and culture could not be resolved simply by removing Christians from the culture, that the culture itself needed to be transformed. And that's really the direction we see things going in this period from the 1950s and 60s forward. People were rather embarrassed by the so-called monkey trial and the conflicts about evolution. It had left Christians looking really behind the times, right? Really unwilling to engage with the findings of modern science and other such things. And so this new direction of evangelicalism meant to correct what were perceived as those errors. Rather than reject U.S. culture, people like Charles Fuller argued Christians should seek to reconnect with it. Through his outlet Christianity Today and the institution of Fuller Theological Seminary, this approach was spread by the radio evangelist Charles Fuller, depicted here on the slide. Another crucial figure of this movement is Billy Graham, a really well-known preacher, fairly recently deceased. He lived a very long life. But Billy Graham became a really mainstream figure in the country and opposed this so-called oppositionalism toward U.S. culture. He wanted to, as the phrase was at the time, meet people where they are, right, and preach the gospel to them in a way that didn't require them to kind of reject all of American society, but rather to see American society in the deepest sense as profoundly Christian. Clearly, there have been many debates around this, but this is the aim of the movement. After the liberal Christian crisis in the 1960s, evangelicalism goes mainstream. It gains political influence, especially in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party. Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush were both evangelical Christians. In the 1960s, around the same time, you see the same tension between Christianity and culture being negotiated in a different way in an event known as the Second Vatican Council. On the slide here, you see depicted Pope John the 23rd, who was elected in 1958 and promptly announced that he would convene a council, like the Council of Chalcedon, like the Council of Nicaea. It would be an ecumenical council to address issues of the relation between the church and the modern world. Now, going back to last week, remember the First Vatican Council was a kind of, talk about a circling of the wagons, right? It was a fortress mentality. We're going to shore up the strength of the church in a moment where the papal states had been lost and a lot of social transformation had occurred. This spirit of this council was different. It was looking for, and this was a watchword of the council, dialogue. It was looking for openness. Um, Two important concepts that drove the work of the council were aggiornamento and risorgimento. Aggiornamento is an Italian word meaning to bring things up to date, that is, to change things in the church, to develop things. The word change is difficult, right? To be more responsive to modern realities and the experience of people in the modern world, but also ressourcement, to look for resources, as that French word would have it, in our knowledge of the earliest practices of the church, to go back to those earliest practices, to renew what is happening now in the Catholic Church according to what we know about what the earliest Christians practiced. The Second Vatican Council led to many changes, visible changes, in how the Catholic Church, how the Catholic faith is practiced. The Mass was now celebrated in the local language called the vernacular in English, French, Spanish, German, whatever the language might be, in that local place. Modern biblical criticism was accepted, so the church opened itself to the historical critical study of Scripture, to not only treat it as simply revealed by God, but as revealed by God through certain human authors who themselves were influenced by their local circumstances. It expressed a new view on other religions, recognizing the truth expressed in every major world religion and affirming that truth in a way it had never done before, Catholic Church had never done before, and also affirming the role of the laity and the need for, so to speak, collegiality of bishops under the Pope. So not only would the Pope be the central person telling everybody what to do, underneath him, but that the laity, that is, people who are not ordained as priests or are not religious, brothers or sisters, nuns or monks, but the laity would have a certain authority in the church, or if not authority, a voice, and that the bishops would work together in as colleagues, collegiality, as colleagues of the Pope, to make decisions. This council was very controversial, of course, and led to a controversy in the church between so-called liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics. You may be familiar with this distinction. It has remained important in the Catholic Church ever since Vatican II, and it does continue to this day. At the same time as Vatican II, we come to the civil rights movement in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. Martin Luther King Jr. here is again depicted. And as noted at the top of my remarks here today, this was driven largely by the so-called Black church, by churches throughout the United States that were predominantly Black, historically Black, and came together and inspired people to stand up for their rights against Jim Crow laws, against redlining, against a lot of the injustices that we have happily become more familiar with and aware of in these recent years. This movement challenged segregation in the South. It demanded respect for the dignity of all. And importantly, it drew on biblical images, especially the image of the Exodus, the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. This was a people enslaved, and Moses led them to freedom, to the promised land, right? And King himself, over the course of his career, adopted more and more and in different ways the persona of Moses, of this leader who would lead his people out of slavery, either legally or in effect. There were two developments identified by McGrath from the civil rights movement. The first is that the church has re-entered political life in the U.S., but not along partisan lines. Both Republicans and Democrats supported the civil rights movement. I mean, in different ways. Obviously, the history is very complex, but this was seen as a justice issue in the end. King's work showed that this could be done without churches compromising their principles. So again, we have that tension between Christianity and the culture, right? And King shows that he can stand up as a preacher in the National Mall in Washington, D.C., deliver his I Have a Dream speech almost as a sermon, right? A Baptist-style sermon. But he can, in an uncompromising way, express those Christian convictions and achieve political results. That is the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964-65, respectively, inspired by those Christian convictions. In a different spirit somewhat, but also in certain ways similarly, we see a rise after this of the religious right. I say similarly because both of these movements are movements that regard Christianity as having a legitimate place in public discourse, at least on the level of motivation, and perhaps on a greater level. What is called the religious right often wanted to see this on a greater level and to see the country actually recognize itself as, in some sense, a Christian nation. We still hear that language very often today. We have here on the slide a very different group engages in the political process to prevent secularization of public life and to protect prayer in schools. Prayer in schools was a major issue addressed by the religious right in the 60s and 70s. A series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s, changing expectations, changing laws around those practices were a quote-unquote wake-up call to these mostly evangelical Christians in the manner we've already discussed. Leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson sought to defend what they called Christian values. They imagined a kind of simpler, small-town America of the past. They called for a return to the values of that time. In a way, it was similar to early fundamentalism in that it was very opposed to mainstream culture, but it was also similar to evangelicalism. I mean, all of these movements also continue alongside each other. But the religious right, so-called, was similar to evangelicalism in that it actually sought to engage. It sought to actually win elective office in the country and to bring about policy changes, legal changes, to help the country reflect more closely what it understood as its deep Christian identity. A key issue here, highlighted by McGrath, is the wall of separation between church and state. From the point of view of the religious right, this wall of separation does not require that religion be excluded from public life. What we saw when we talked about Roger Williams in past weeks, right? For Roger Williams, the claim was not that the religion should never enter public life for him personally. The claim was that the government should never dabble in or interfere in religion. Right? So these figures associated with the religious right are in a way going back to the very early understanding of this wall of separation. Itself a very contested field, and I don't ask us to take any particular position on it, but we can note that historical connection between Roger Williams' conception of it as expressed in our course here and that expression held by the religious right. An important figure at this time, so now we're up to the late 1970s, a really important figure was Pope John Paul II, the first non-Italian pope to be elected in a very long time. He was elected in 1979 in what was known as the Year of Three Popes. Pope Paul VI, now Saint Pope Paul VI, died in that year, 1979. He was succeeded very briefly, a matter of weeks and perhaps months, by John Paul I, another Italian bishop. And that individual, John Paul I, died very soon after being elected. He was succeeded in turn by John Paul II, known as, his name was Karol Wojtyła. He was from Poland, the Archbishop of Krakow, and himself a philosopher and a person who had been influential at the Second Vatican Council. Um, at the time, there was a great division in the Catholic Church, and we could say this remains in play today, a division over what direction the Church should take. Should it continue the reforms in the so-called spirit of the Council, opening more and more to the world, right? Accommodating itself, but also transforming culture. We've seen other examples of this, right? Of Christianity engaging with culture. Or should it retrench and protect long-standing Catholic traditions? This is more like the fundamentalist view, more like the religious right view, right? I'm going to have an opposition between the church and the world. They're going to be separate from each other. Maybe they're going to be at loggerheads with each other. That same dynamic gets reproduced here in the Catholic Church. We've already noted this so-called liberal conservative language. He was seen, John Paul I, at first as a reforming pope, kind of on the first side of that, but then over time he came to be seen more as a conservative voice. I say the so-called liberal conservative split because in a way that language, which is derived from the French Revolution and derived from political life, is not adequate to understand the dynamics that are in play in these Christian debates. John Paul II participated on kind of both sides of that divide. He was a charismatic leader. John Paul II, he was also instrumental in the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and throughout that time leading up to that, challenging the power of the USSR. Being from Poland, of course, Poland is right next to the USSR. He'd grown up within that Iron Curtain, so-called, within that Soviet sphere of influence, had seen the effect of the suppression of religion discussed earlier in our remarks here. We're going to conclude on this slide, though there's, of course, so much more to say. That we offer other classes at the college that will treat more contemporary themes in theology. Two of those themes that such courses treat are feminism and liberation theology. Theology is not only the study of God in God's self, but a study of how God interacts with the world, or in some way connects with the world, right? And when we do that, we're looking at the experience of many different people from many different points of view. And so theology has sought to be more articulate about different positions that people occupy in society and the ways in which those positions can lead to their unjust oppression and silencing. It has been taken as a task of Christian theology very widely to oppose such injustice and to enable all people as children of God, as brothers and sisters in Christ from a Christian point of view, to participate in the life of the church in a way similar to what was seen in the earliest years of the church, even before Constantine adopted it as the religion of the Roman Empire. The liberation of women and oppressed peoples is a focus of 1960s to 1980s in Christian life. It says here on the slide, of course, it's a focus throughout Western societies, very important, and focus often a source of violence and conflict. Feminists call for a greater representation of women within church leadership. And they also challenge bias toward male role models and language. For example, the image of God as Father. Why is God always Father? I mean, certainly that language is used biblically, but wouldn't it be the case that God is beyond gender? I mean, certainly theologians would agree with that. So if that's the case, that God is neither male nor female, certainly, then why are we using exclusively male language? What human institutions is the choice to use that language serving to uphold? This is the kind of question that feminist theologians, very importantly, will ask. Liberation theology, in its turn, uses Marxist ideas as a tool of social analysis, offering a political program to challenge unjust systems, leading in part to our last point on the slide here, the Council of Medellin in Colombia in 1968, which challenges the role of the church in Colombian and Central and South American societies, and calling for what is called a preferential option for the poor, that when determining one's position with respect to social policy or political life, or even an understanding of the church and of Christian teaching, one ought to take into account first and foremost always the poor, those who are the least in society, because it is to those whom Jesus Christ most of all was attracted and sought to convey his teaching. Of course, it's interesting, starting roughly with the Russian Revolution as we did, to now conclude again with the ideas of Marx as adopted by liberation theologians. Liberation theologians were, in many ways, I shouldn't say were, I mean are, a continuing movement in theology, critical of power structures within the church, of hierarchical structures, of features of Christian life that seem to be removed from its central aim to liberate the oppressed and to liberate ourselves from sin. Um, However, they believe that Marxist ideas can be used. We've said this phrase already, a tool of social analysis, that Marx got the diagnosis right. Right? So maybe Marx was mistaken, maybe he's been applied in a way that was not necessary by people like Lenin or Stalin. Maybe he himself was negative toward religion in ways that are not necessary. However, his diagnosis, his understanding of economic life and of power relations between peoples, that is accurate. These liberation theologians hazarded, held, and that should be adopted by Christians as a tool, right, to analyze the situation and then to act in ways to achieve greater justice, motivated precisely by their Christian faith. And so, friends, that wraps up our survey of the history of Christianity. I hope that you have found these lectures informative and you have found the class engaging. I look forward to seeing you for our last session.